The cop flicked on his lights for what he thought was just another routine stop. But tonight, the system would betray them both. Officer Dan Mercer only saw a black man in an expensive car, already writing the story in his head. What he didn't see was the Medal of Honor on the back seat. What he couldn't know was that Marcus Johnson wasn't just a war hero. He was the one man who could expose the rot at the heart of their city. When that flashlight beam hits the gold medal, their fates lock in a deadly game where badges mean nothing, and the truth comes with a price. Something will happen next in this story that you would have never imagined. From which country are you enjoying this story? Make sure to tell us in the comments. Subscribe now, because this traffic stop is about to detonate into a conspiracy where the hunter becomes the hunted, and the only way out is through the fire.
The cop flicked on his lights. It was just another traffic stop. Routine. Boring even. Officer Dan Mercer had done this 100 times. Maybe 1,000. Check the plate, run the name, look for nervous hands, darting eyes. The usual dance. But tonight was different. The car in front of him was sleek, black, expensive. The kind of car that didn't belong in this part of town. And the man behind the wheel? Black. That was enough. Dan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He could already hear the guys back at the station laughing about it. Mercer bagged himself a drug dealer. He smirked. This was gonna be easy. Little did he know, he had just pulled over the wrong man. Inside the car, Marcus Johnson didn't even flinch when the red and blue lights flashed behind him. He had faced worse. Much worse. The desert heat of Fallujah. The deafening roar of IEDs. The weight of his best friend's body as he dragged him through gunfire. A cop. Please. Marcus exhaled, slow and controlled, like the therapist had taught him. Asterisk breathe in. Breathe out. Asterisk the scars on his back itched. A phantom pain from the shrapnel still lodged near his spine. He glanced in the rear-view mirror. The cop was taking his sweet time. Classic power move. Marcus knew the drill. He'd been through this before. Too many times. But tonight, he wasn't in the mood. The cop's flashlight blinded him as he approached. License and registration. Marcus handed them over without a word. Officer Mercer squinted at the name. Marcus Johnson. No warrants. Clean record. But something about this guy rubbed him the wrong way. Too calm. Too unafraid. You know why I pulled you over? Marcus kept his voice steady. No, sir. Your taillight's out. A lie. A flimsy one. Marcus almost laughed. He checked his lights before leaving the house. You sure about that? Dan's jaw tightened. Who the hell does this guy think he is? Step out of the car. Marcus hesitated. He knew what came next. The pat-down. The routine questions. The slow, creeping dread of being just one wrong move away from a headline. But then, a glint of metal on the back seat caught the cop's eye. Dan's hand flew to his holster. What the hell is that? Marcus didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was there. His Medal of Honor. Dan's fingers hovered over his gun. Marcus sighed, reached back slowly, and lifted the velvet case. You mean this? The cop's eyes locked onto the gold medal, the one given only to soldiers who stared death in the face and didn't blink. And in that moment, everything changed. Marcus watched the cop's expression shift. Confusion first, then something like recognition, then something deeper, something uglier. Shame, maybe. Or anger. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Dan's mouth opened, then closed. His fingers twitched near his gun, but he didn't draw. Marcus said nothing. He just waited. Finally, Dan cleared his throat. Where'd you get that? Marcus kept his eyes steady. The president handed it to me. After Ramadi. Dan's face went pale. Ramadi. Every cop knew Ramadi. Every soldier. It was the bloodiest urban battle since Hugh. Dan had a cousin who died there. Marcus saw the flicker in the cop's eyes, the moment the pieces connected. The cop swallowed hard. You were there. Marcus nodded. 3 tours. Dan's grip on the flashlight loosened. He took a step back, like the weight of the words had physically pushed him. Marcus could see the war going on behind the cop's eyes. Pride, prejudice, guilt, all crashing together. For the first time in years, Dan Mercer didn't know what to say. The radio on Dan's shoulder crackled to life. Unit 47, status check? Dan hesitated, then keyed the mic. All good. False alarm. The dispatcher's voice was skeptical. You sure? Dan's eyes never left Marcus. Yeah, I'm sure. He handed back the license and registration. Marcus took them, slow and deliberate. Dan shifted his weight. You have a good night, sir. The sir hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Marcus nodded once. You too, officer. Dan turned and walked back to his cruiser, his steps slower than before. Marcus watched him go, then glanced at the medal on the seat beside him. He hadn't planned on bringing it tonight. Hadn't even wanted to look at it. But something had made him grab it on the way out the door. Maybe instinct, maybe fate. He put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving the cop standing in the red glow of his own taillights. Dan sat in his cruiser for a long time after Marcus drove off. His hands shook. He thought about his cousin, about the funeral, about the flag folded into a triangle and handed to his aunt. He thought about the things he'd said at the bar after, drunk and angry. Asterisk, they should have nuked the whole damn country. Asterisk. He thought about the way Marcus had looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, but with something worse. Pity. Dan turned the key and started the engine. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel like a cop. He felt like a fool. Marcus drove in silence, the city lights blurring past. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister. You coming or what? He typed back. On my way. Then he hesitated, added. Asterisk got held up. Long story. Asterisk. He put the phone down and flexed his fingers on the wheel. The scars on his back still itched. Some wounds never really healed. He wondered if the cop would remember this night. If it would change anything. Probably not. But maybe. Marcus sighed and turned up the radio, letting the music drown out the memories. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. He kept driving. The diner was nearly empty at this hour. Marcus slid into the booth by the window, the cracked vinyl seat creaking under his weight. His sister, Keisha, sat across from him, stirring her coffee absently. She took one look at his face and sighed. Let me guess. Another one. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Keisha shook her head, her braid swaying. I told you to get that damn medal framed. Put it on the wall where people can see it before they start with their nonsense. It was in the car. And? You think that stops them? She leaned forward, her voice dropping. Marcus, you could have the president himself riding shotgun and some of these cops would still. I know. The waitress approached, her smile fading when she saw Marcus's expression. She placed their orders silently, pancakes for Keisha, eggs and bacon for Marcus, and hurried away. Keisha stabbed at her food. You should report him. To who? His buddies. So what? You just let it go. Marcus picked up his fork. The eggs were cold. I'm alive, aren't I? Dan Mercer's shift ended at dawn. He clocked out without speaking to anyone, ignoring the raised eyebrows when he declined the usual post-work drinks. His apartment was dark when he arrived, the silence pressing against his ears. He tossed his keys on the counter and stared at his reflection in the microwave door. The face looking back was unfamiliar. Tired eyes, a mouth set in a hard line. He'd worn that expression before, but tonight it felt different, like a mask that no longer fit. The metal flashed in his memory again. The way the streetlights had caught the gold. The weight of it in Marcus's hands. Dan opened his laptop. It took less than 5 minutes to find the name. Marcus Johnson. Distinguished Service Cross. Upgraded to Medal of Honor after review. Ramadi. Fallujah. 2 Purple Hearts. The photos loaded slowly. A younger Marcus in uniform. Marcus standing stiffly beside the president. Marcus with his arm around another soldier, both of them grinning, covered in dust, the desert stretching endlessly behind them. Dan closed the browser. His phone buzzed. A text from his partner, Mike. Asterisk, you good? You left like your ass was on fire. Asterisk. Dan typed back. Asterisk, fine. Just tired. Asterisk. He hesitated, then added, You ever pull over a Medal of Honor recipient? The response was immediate. Asterisk, well, no. Why? Asterisk. Dan didn't reply. Marcus's therapist had told him to try writing. It doesn't have to be for anyone else, she'd said. Just get the words out. He'd laughed at the time. What was there to say? That war was hell? That coming home was worse? That no amount of medals could fill the hole where his best friend used to be? But tonight, he opened the notebook. Dear Jamal. His pen hovered over the page. The words wouldn't come. He could still see it. The flash of the IED, the way Jamal had shoved him aside a split second before the blast. The blood, the screaming, the weight of Jamal's body as Marcus dragged him to cover, already knowing it was too late. Marcus closed the notebook. The apartment was too quiet. Dan's dreams were full of gunfire. He woke gasping. The sheets tangled around his legs. The clock read 3:17 a.m. This wasn't new. The dreams had started after his cousin's funeral, though he'd never admit it to anyone. Cops didn't have PTSD. Cops were the ones who handled it, who kept it together when everyone else fell apart. Except he wasn't keeping it together. He reached for the bottle on his nightstand. Marcus's phone rang at 4:23 a.m. He knew before he answered. Knew from the way the ringtone cut through the dark, urgent and insistent. Johnson. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. Sergeant, we need you to come in. Marcus was already pulling on his pants. How bad? Bad enough. Dan's lieutenant called him in early. The briefing room was packed. Tension thick in the air. On the screen at the front, a map of the city was overlaid with red markers. 3 bomb threats in the past 2 hours, the lieutenant said. All targeting police stations. We have reason to believe this is coordinated. Dan's stomach turned. The lieutenant continued. Witnesses report seeing a black male in military fatigues near each location prior to the calls. A photo flashed on the screen. Dan's blood ran cold. Marcus Johnson stared back at him. Marcus stood in the dimly lit warehouse, the phone pressed to his ear. Tell me again why I'm here, he said. The voice on the other end was calm. Because you're the only one who can stop this. Marcus looked at the device on the table in front of him. The wires. The timer. You set me up. No, the voice said. I gave you a choice. The line went dead. Dan's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. The address on the screen matched the warehouse district. Backup was 10 minutes out. 10 minutes too long. He thought about the medal. About the look in Marcus's eyes. About the bomb threats. His foot pressed harder on the gas. Marcus heard the car before he saw it. The squeal of tires. The slam of a door. Then Dan Mercer burst in, gun drawn. Hands where I can see them. Marcus didn't move. The bomb ticked quietly between them. The warehouse air was thick with dust and the sharp tang of old motor oil. Marcus kept his hands visible, palms out, but didn't raise them. His breathing was steady. He'd faced worse than a nervous cop with a shaky trigger finger. Dan's gun didn't waver. Step away from the device. Marcus glanced at the bomb. You know what this is? I know you're involved in the threats against my department. That's not an answer. Dan's finger tightened on the trigger. Move. Now. Marcus studied the cop's face. The sweat on his brow, the way his eyes kept darting to the wires. He'd seen that look before. On rookies in their first firefight. You ever disarmed one of these? Marcus asked. Shut up. Because if you haven't, you might want to lower that gun before you accidentally. I said shut up. Dan's shout echoed off the metal walls. His breath came fast now. You think I don't know what you're doing? You military types, all that training, all that discipline, and for what? To come home and terrorize the people you swore to protect. Marcus's jaw tightened. You don't know shit about what I swore. The bomb beeped. Both men froze. The timer clicked down. 4:59. 4:58. Dan's voice cracked. What did you do? Marcus turned slowly to the device. Not me. He pointed to a small camera mounted in the rafters. Him. The screen flickered to life. A man in a black balaclava smiled at them. Officer Mercer. Sergeant Johnson. So glad you could join us. Dan's gun swung toward the screen. Who the hell are you? Call me a concerned citizen. The man's voice was smooth, almost cheerful, though I suppose that depends on your perspective. Marcus didn't move. What do you want? What do I want? The man leaned closer to the camera. Justice. Accountability. A reckoning for the sins of this city's so-called protectors. Dan's grip tightened. You're blowing up police stations for justice? Not blowing up. Testing. The man gestured to the bomb. That's a dummy. Harmless. The real test was whether Officer Mercer would shoot first and ask questions later when confronted with a black man standing next to what appears to be an explosive device. The blood drained from Dan's face. Marcus kept his eyes on the screen. And if he had? The man smiled. Then the world would have seen the truth. The video ended. The warehouse was silent except for their breathing. Dan's gun arm dropped to his side. His whole body shook. Marcus exhaled slowly. You were set up. Dan didn't answer. Marcus moved toward the bomb, examining it closely. Like he said, it's fake. He picked up a wire. Bad wiring job too. Amateur. Dan finally found his voice. Why you? Marcus set the device down. Because I'm the one who testified against Captain Ryerson last year. The name hit Dan like a punch. Ryerson, the disgraced narcotics officer who'd been running his own drug ring. The case that nearly tore the department apart. Marcus continued. Your masked friend? Probably one of Ryerson's boys. This whole thing. He kicked the fake bomb. Payback. Sirens wailed in the distance. Dan looked at Marcus. They'll arrest you. Probably. You should go. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You're letting me leave? Dan holstered his gun. I'm not letting you do anything. But if you happen to disappear before backup arrives. Marcus studied the cop for a long moment, then nodded. He was gone before the first squad car arrived. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed overhead as Dan sat across from Internal Affairs, his hands folded tightly on the table. Lieutenant Grayson, a grizzled veteran with cold eyes, paced slowly behind the two investigators. You expect us to believe, Grayson said, his voice low and dangerous, that you just happened to stumble onto that warehouse alone? No backup. No call for assistance. Dan kept his voice steady. I had a tip. From who? Anonymous source. One of the investigators, a sharp-faced woman with auburn hair, leaned forward. And this source, they just magically knew where to find a bomb threat suspect before anyone else? Dan didn't blink. I followed a lead. Grayson stopped pacing. You're lying. The room went silent. Dan exhaled slowly. I saw Johnson's photo in the briefing. I recognized him from a traffic stop earlier that night. Thought I could talk to him before things escalated. The investigator scoffed. Talk to him? You went in guns blazing, Mercer. Patrol unit said they heard you shouting before they even breached. Dan's jaw tightened. I was doing my job. Grayson's fist slammed onto the table. Your job isn't playing goddamn hero. You compromised an active investigation. Dan said nothing. The female investigator flipped through her notes. Here's what I don't get. You pulled this guy over earlier. Clean record, war hero, no reason to detain him. And then hours later, he's our prime suspect in domestic terrorism? And you just happened to find him before anyone else. She closed the file. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. Dan's stomach dropped. What are you implying? Grayson leaned in, his breath hot with coffee and contempt. We're implying you're either the dumbest cop on the force, or you're in on it. Marcus watched the news report from a dingy motel room. The volume turned low. Asterisk, Ongoing investigation into last night's bomb threats. Police have identified a person of interest but stress that no arrests have been made. Asterisk. The screen cut to a press conference. Chief Morales stood at the podium, her expression grim. Asterisk. We are treating these threats as acts of domestic terrorism. The individual we're seeking is considered armed and dangerous. Asterisk. A photo flashed on screen. Marcus's military ID photo. Marcus muted the TV. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Yeah. Keisha's voice was strained. They're at my apartment, Marcus. Cops. FBI. They're tearing the place apart. Marcus closed his eyes. Don't talk to them. They're saying you, her voice cracked. They're saying you planted those threats. That you're working with some militia group. Marcus stood, pacing the cramped room. Listen to me. Go to Ma's house. Don't use your phone. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Marcus, what the hell did you do? Nothing. He gripped the phone tighter. But someone's making it look like I did. A pause. Then quieter. That cop from last night. Mercer. They showed his picture on the news too. Said he's suspended pending investigation. Marcus stopped pacing. They're setting us both up. Keisha's breath hitched. What do you need? Marcus looked at the duffel bag on the bed. The gun inside. The cash. The fake ID he hoped he wouldn't have to use. Just get somewhere safe, he said. I'll fix this. Dan's apartment smelled like whiskey and regret. He sat on the floor, back against the couch. His service weapon disassembled on the coffee table. Cleaning it gave him something to focus on. Something besides the fact that his career was over. The knock at the door startled him. He didn't move. Another knock. Harder. Dan. Open up. Mike's voice. Dan considered ignoring him. But Mike had a key. He'd just let himself in eventually. Dan stood, his body aching like he'd been in a fight. He opened the door. Mike looked him up and down. The stubble, the rumpled clothes, the empty bottle on the counter. Jesus. You look like hell. Dan turned away. What do you want? Mike stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I want to know why you're taking the fall for this. Dan barked a laugh. I'm not taking the fall. I am the fall. Mike grabbed his arm, spinning him around. Cut the self-pity crap. IA's building a case against you. Conspiracy. Aiding a fugitive. They're saying you and Johnson planned this together. Dan yanked his arm free. That's insane. Is it? Mike's eyes were hard. Because from where I'm standing, you've been acting weird ever since that traffic stop. Then you magically find the guy before anyone else? And now he's vanished. Mike shook his head. Talk to me, Dan. Before it's too late. Dan looked at his friend, his only friend, and made a decision. Sit down, he said. I'll tell you everything. Marcus parked the stolen car 3 blocks from the precinct. The rain had started, a cold drizzle that soaked through his jacket. He pulled the baseball cap lower, keeping his head down as he walked. The precinct was crawling with cops. More than usual. Marcus ducked into an alley, pulling out the burner phone. He dialed from memory. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Yeah, Captain Vasquez. It's Johnson. A pause. Then, you've got some nerve calling me, Sergeant. I didn't do this. Don't care. Vasquez's voice dropped. You're a fugitive now. My hands are tied. Marcus leaned against the wet brick wall. I need access to the case files. The real ones, not whatever bullshit they're feeding the press. Vasquez exhaled sharply. Even if I believed you, which I don't, why the hell would I risk my pension for some disgraced jarhead? Because you know Ryerson was dirty. And you know this has his stink all over it. Silence. Then, midnight, parking garage beneath the courthouse. Come unarmed. The line went dead. Marcus pocketed the phone. Across the street, a patrol car rolled by, its spotlight sweeping the sidewalk. Marcus melted deeper into the shadows. The courthouse garage was eerily quiet at midnight, the only sound the distant drip of water from leaking pipes. Marcus stood near a concrete pillar, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the entrance. Vasquez was late. Not a good sign. Marcus was about to leave when headlights cut through the darkness. A black SUV rolled slowly down the ramp, stopping 20 feet away. The driver's door opened. Vasquez stepped out, thicker around the middle than in his army days, his hair more gray than black, but still carrying himself like a man who expected to be obeyed. Marcus didn't move. Vasquez glanced around, then walked to the rear of the vehicle and popped the trunk. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and tossed it onto the hood. There. Happy. Marcus approached slowly, keeping his distance. You alone? You think I'm stupid? Vasquez crossed his arms. Ryerson's got friends everywhere. Johnson. Including in my department. Marcus picked up the envelope. Inside were crime scene photos, phone records, a case file stamped classified. He flipped through them quickly. This doesn't make sense. The calls came from burners. No way to trace. Look at the timestamps, Vasquez interrupted. Marcus did, then froze. The first bomb threat call had been placed before Marcus was even pulled over. Vasquez's voice was grim. They had you pegged from the start, son. This was never about terrorism. It was about silencing the man who took down Ryerson. Marcus's hands tightened on the papers. And Mercer. Collateral damage. IA's been looking for an excuse to clean house ever since the Ryerson scandal. A racist cop and a disgruntled vet working together to attack the police. Vasquez snorted. Perfect scapegoats. Marcus stared at the files. At the dates. The lies. Someone had planned this for months. And he'd walked right into it. The rain had turned into a downpour by the time Marcus left the garage. The files were tucked inside his jacket, protected from the water soaking through his clothes. He kept his head down as he walked, his mind racing through the information Vasquez had given him. The timestamps didn't lie. The first bomb threat had been called in nearly an hour before Dan Mercer had even pulled him over. Which meant this wasn't just a setup, it was a well-orchestrated trap. And Marcus had walked right into it. He needed to find Dan. The problem was, Dan Mercer wasn't answering his phone. Marcus ducked into an all-night diner, the kind of place with sticky floors and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. He took a booth in the back, away from the windows, and spread the files out under the dim glow of the overhead light. The phone records were the most damning. Calls made from burner phones, all traced back to locations near police stations. But the timing was impossible. The first call had been placed while Marcus was still at home, watching TV. The second while he was at the diner with Keisha. The third had been made after Dan had already entered the warehouse. Marcus's fingers traced the timeline. Someone had been watching them. Someone had known exactly where Dan would go, exactly when Marcus would be there. The waitress approached, her tired eyes barely registering him. Coffee. Marcus nodded. Black. She poured it without comment and moved on. Marcus flipped to the crime scene photos. The warehouse had been swept clean. Too clean. No fingerprints. No fibers. Just the dummy bomb, left behind like a taunt. And then there was Dan. Internal Affairs was tearing his life apart. Suspended without pay. Under investigation for conspiracy. His reputation in shreds. Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temples. He didn't owe Dan Mercer anything. The cop had pulled him over for no reason, had come at him with a gun drawn, had been ready to believe the worst of him from the start. But this wasn't just about Dan. This was about Ryerson. Marcus closed the files. He needed to move. Dan's phone buzzed for the 10th time that night. He ignored it. Mike had left hours ago, after Dan had told him everything. The traffic stop, the medal, the warehouse, the masked man on the screen. Mike had listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. When Dan finished, Mike had just shaken his head. You're screwed. Thanks for the optimism. I'm serious, Dan. IA's not gonna care that you were set up. They want a fall guy. And Johnson, he's a ghost. If he's smart, he's halfway to Mexico by now. Dan had wanted to argue, but he didn't have the energy. Now, alone again, he stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His phone buzzed again. Dan finally grabbed it, ready to throw it across the room, then froze. Unknown number. The text was short. Asterisk, you want the truth? Meet me. 3 a.m. Pier 17. Asterisk. Dan's pulse spiked. He knew who it was. The pier was deserted at this hour, the only light coming from the distant glow of the city across the water. The air smelled of salt and rust, the wooden planks creaking underfoot as Marcus walked to the edge. He didn't turn when he heard footsteps behind him. You're late. Dan's voice was rough. I wasn't sure I was coming. Marcus finally turned. Dan looked worse than he had in the warehouse. Eyes bloodshot, stubble darker, like he hadn't slept in days. His hands were jammed in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Marcus nodded toward the water. You packin'? Dan didn't answer. Marcus smirked. Guess that's a yes. Dan's jaw tightened. What do you want, Johnson? Same thing you do. The truth. I already know the truth. You're a fugitive. I'm a disgraced cop. Someone played us both. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out the files. Someone named Ryerson. Dan stiffened. What? Marcus tossed the files at Dan's feet. Take a look. Dan hesitated, then crouched, keeping one hand near his waistband as he flipped through the papers. His eyes scanned the phone records, the timestamps, the classified case notes. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. Where'd you get these? Doesn't matter. Marcus crossed his arms. What matters is that Ryerson's people set this whole thing up. They called in those bomb threats before you even pulled me over. They knew you'd come after me. They knew how it would look. Dan stood slowly, the files clenched in his fist. Why? Because you and I are loose ends. Marcus's voice was flat. You testified against Ryerson's guys in that brutality case last year. I put him away. Now he's tying up loose ends from prison. Dan shook his head. This is insane. It's smart. Marcus turned back to the water. They discredit us both in one move. You're a dirty cop. I'm a terrorist. No one listens to either of us ever again. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant sirens. Dan exhaled sharply. So what now? Marcus glanced at him. Now we fight back. Dan's apartment was a mess. Takeout containers on the coffee table, clothes strewn across the floor, the TV muted but flickering with another news segment about the rogue cop and the veteran terrorist. Marcus ignored it, spreading the files across Dan's kitchen table. Dan watched him from the doorway, arms crossed. You realize if anyone finds you here, we're both dead, right? Marcus didn't look up. Then I guess we better not get caught. Dan rubbed his temples. This is insane. You keep saying that. Marcus tapped a photo. This guy. Recognize him. Dan leaned in. The photo showed a man in a police uniform, standing beside Ryerson at some department event. Hargrove, Dan said. Ryerson's old partner. Got transferred to evidence after Ryerson went down. Marcus nodded. And where's evidence located? Downtown precinct. Basement level. Dan's eyes narrowed. Why? Marcus flipped to another page. A log of evidence locker access. Hargrove's name appeared 3 times in the past week. Because if Ryerson's running this from prison, Marcus said, he's doing it through Hargrove. And if we want proof, that's where we'll find it. Dan stared at him. You want to break into a police precinct. I want to prove we were set up. Dan laughed, sharp and humorless. Even if we got in, which we won't, the place is crawling with cops. Cameras everywhere. Motion sensors. Keycard access. Marcus met his gaze. You're a cop. Or did you forget? Dan's expression darkened. I'm suspended, in case you missed the memo. But you still have your badge. Your ID. Your face. Marcus leaned forward. All we need is 5 minutes in that evidence room. Dan shook his head. This is suicide. And sitting here waiting for IA to bury us isn't? Dan didn't answer. Marcus pushed the files toward him. Your choice, Mercer. But if we don't do this, Ryerson wins. And we both disappear. The silence stretched. Finally, Dan let out a long breath. When do we move? The downtown precinct was quieter at night, but not empty. Patrol officers came and went, dispatchers worked the overnight shift, and the occasional detective trudged through, coffee in hand, working a late case. Dan adjusted his collar, his badge hanging visibly from his belt. Beside him, Marcus kept his head down, dressed in janitor's clothes they'd lifted from a supply closet. "This'll never work," Dan muttered. Marcus didn't respond. They moved quickly, Dan leading the way through the familiar halls, nodding at the occasional officer who passed. No one looked twice at him. No one glanced at Marcus. That was the thing about people. They saw what they expected to see. A cop walking with a janitor? Nothing unusual. The evidence room was on the lowest level, accessible by a keycard locked elevator. Dan swiped his badge, still active despite his suspension, and the doors opened. So far, so good. The elevator descended. Marcus kept his voice low. Cameras. Everywhere. Dan didn't look at him. But the evidence room itself is a blind spot. Too sensitive for recordings. Marcus nodded. The doors opened. The hallway was empty. They moved quickly, Dan swiping his badge again at the evidence room door. The light turned green. The lock clicked. They stepped inside. The room was cold, rows of metal shelves stretching into the darkness, each labeled with case numbers and dates. Dan exhaled. Now what? Marcus was already moving. Now we find Ryerson's file. The evidence room smelled like old paper and industrial cleaner. Marcus moved down the aisles with quiet efficiency, scanning the labels on the shelves. Dan followed, his nerves frayed with every second they spent inside. Ryerson's case should be near the back, Dan muttered. High-profile trials get their own section. Marcus nodded, turning the corner. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows between the shelves. Then he stopped. Here. The box was marked Ryerson, Captain Anthony, case hashtag 47835. Marcus pulled it down, setting it on the floor between them. Inside were files, photographs, even a few evidence bags with tagged items. A burner phone, a stack of cash, a badge. Dan crouched beside him, flipping through the files. What are we looking for? Connections. Marcus pulled out a stack of phone records. Ryerson didn't plan this alone. He had help. Inside and outside the department. Dan's fingers brushed against a familiar name in the logs. Hargrove. Marcus leaned over. How many calls? Enough. Dan's jaw tightened. Dozens in the months before Ryerson's arrest. Then nothing until 3 weeks ago. Marcus checked the dates. Right when the bomb threat started. Dan exhaled sharply. Son of a bitch. A noise from the hallway made them both freeze. Footsteps. Dan's hand went to his sidearm out of instinct. Marcus closed the box silently, listening. The footsteps passed. Marcus waited a beat, then turned back to the files. We need proof. Something that ties Hargrove to the threats directly. Dan rifled through the box again, then paused. Wait. He pulled out a small notepad, the kind cops carried in their pockets. Ryerson's personal notes. Dan flipped through it, then stopped on a page near the end. His blood ran cold. Look at this. Marcus leaned in. The page was a list of names. Some were crossed out. Others had notes beside them. And at the bottom, circled twice. Mercer and Johnson, frame job. Next to it, a phone number. Dan recognized the prefix. That's Hargrove's private line. Marcus took the notepad, studying it. This is it. This is what we need. Dan stood abruptly. We have to go. Now. Marcus tucked the notepad into his jacket and replaced the box on the shelf. They moved toward the door, just as the handle turned. Dan's breath caught. The door opened. Hargrove stood in the doorway, his hand resting on his gun. Well, he said, smiling coldly. Look what we have here. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Hargrove's gaze flicked between them, his smirk widening. Mercer, I heard you were suspended. What brings you down here? Dan forced his voice steady. Just tying up loose ends. Hargrove stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. Funny. I don't recall you being assigned to any cases. His eyes landed on Marcus. And who's your friend? Marcus didn't answer. His stance was relaxed, but Dan could see the tension in his shoulders, the readiness. Hargrove chuckled. You know, I always thought you were a shit cop, Mercer. But I didn't take you for stupid. He tilted his head. Conspiring with a fugitive? That's a whole new level of stupid. Dan's fingers twitched near his sidearm. We know about Ryerson's plan. Hargrove's smile didn't waver. Do you? We have proof, Marcus said flatly. Hargrove sighed, as if disappointed. And what? You think anyone's going to believe you? He spread his hands. A dirty cop and a terrorist waltz in with some wild story? Please. Dan's pulse pounded in his ears. It's over, Hargrove. Hargrove's expression darkened. No, it's not. His hand moved toward his radio. Marcus was faster. He lunged, slamming Hargrove against the shelves. Evidence boxes toppled, scattering files across the floor. Hargrove snarled, driving an elbow into Marcus's ribs, but Marcus twisted, throwing him to the ground. Dan drew his gun. Don't move. Hargrove laughed, blood on his teeth. You gonna shoot me, Mercer? In a police station. He shook his head. You don't have the balls. Marcus yanked Hargrove up by his collar. Where's the proof? Hargrove spat. Go to hell. Marcus slammed him against the shelves again. The proof. Hargrove's eyes flicked to a security panel near the door. Too late. A siren blared overhead, the evidence room alarm. Dan's stomach dropped. Marcus! Go! Marcus shoved Hargrove aside and bolted for the door. Dan hesitated only a second before following. Behind them, Hargrove's laughter echoed through the chaos. The hallway was already swarming with officers responding to the alarm. Marcus and Dan ducked into a side corridor, their breaths coming fast. We're trapped, Dan hissed. Marcus scanned the hallway. There! A service elevator at the end of the hall. They ran, slipping inside just as a group of officers rounded the corner. Marcus hit the button for the garage level. The doors closed. Dan leaned against the wall, his heart hammering. This is bad. Marcus checked the notepad still tucked in his jacket. We have what we need. Doesn't matter if we don't get out of here alive. The elevator dinged. The garage level. The doors opened to an empty concrete lot, and a lone patrol car idling near the exit. Dan's breath caught. Shit. The officer in the driver's seat looked up, and recognition flashed in his eyes. Mike. Dan froze. Mike stared at them for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded toward the back seat. Dan didn't move. Marcus eyed him. Friend of yours. Dan exhaled. Yeah. They got in the car. Mike didn't speak until they were out of the garage, merging into the late-night traffic. Then, quietly, You're both screwed, you know that, right? Dan rubbed his face. We have proof. Mike glanced at him in the rear view. Better be damn good proof. Marcus leaned forward. It is. Mike sighed. Then let's go end this. The safe house was an old fishing cabin Mike kept on the outskirts of the city, far enough from prying eyes but close enough to reach in an emergency. The wooden walls creaked with the wind, and the scent of salt water lingered in the air. Dan sat at the rickety kitchen table, staring at the notepad they'd taken from the evidence room. The list of names glared up at him, his own circled like a target. Mike tossed a bottle of water at him. You look like hell. Dan caught it without looking. Feel like it too. Marcus stood by the window, peering through the blinds at the dark tree line outside. How long before they track us here? Mike shrugged. Depends how hard they're looking. But with that alarm going off, they'll tear the city apart. Dan rubbed his temples. We need to get this to someone who can actually do something with it. Like who? Mike scoffed. IA's in Ryerson's pocket. The chief's got her head so far up the mayor's ass she can't see straight. Marcus turned from the window. There's always the press. Dan shook his head. No way. We take this public, it becomes a circus. They'll spin it before we even get a chance to explain. Mike leaned against the counter. Then what's the play? Silence settled over the room. The wind rattled the windows. Marcus exhaled sharply. Vasquez. Dan looked up. What? Captain Vasquez. He gave me those files. He knows the system. Knows who to trust. Mike frowned. The army guy? Retired. Works with vets now. Marcus met Dan's gaze. He's clean. Dan hesitated. You sure? Marcus's expression didn't change. I'm sure. Mike pushed off the counter. Then let's go. Vasquez's office was in a nondescript building downtown, sandwiched between a pawnshop and a laundromat. The lights were off. The street empty. Marcus knocked twice. Waited. Then knocked again. A pattern. The door cracked open. Vasquez's tired eyes peered out. Jesus Christ, Johnson. Need your help, Captain. Vasquez glanced past him at Dan and Mike, then sighed and stepped aside. Get in. The office was small, a desk piled with paperwork, a couch with springs poking through the cushions, a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Vasquez locked the door behind them. You realize half the city's looking for you? Marcus pulled the notepad from his jacket. We found this. Vasquez took it, flipping through the pages. His expression darkened. Where? Evidence room. Ryerson's case file. Vasquez exhaled through his nose. Hargrove's name is all over this. Dan stepped forward. We need to take this to someone who can. It's not enough. Vasquez tossed the notepad on the desk. This is circumstantial. Ryerson's already in prison. They'll say this is old. That it doesn't prove he orchestrated the bomb threats. Marcus's jaw tightened. Then we find something that does. Vasquez rubbed his face. How? You're wanted men. You can't just waltz back into the precinct. Mike cleared his throat. What about Hargrove? They all looked at him. Mike shrugged. Guy's dirty. Dirty cops talk. Maybe he's got records. Emails. Something that ties him to Ryerson directly. Dan frowned. He's not going to just hand them over. No, Mike agreed. But he might lead us to them. Silence. Vasquez crossed his arms. You're talking about surveillance. Mike nodded. Tail him. See where he goes, who he meets. Marcus looked at Dan. You know his habits? Dan thought for a moment. He's a creature of routine. Hits the same bar every Friday after shift. The Blue Spot. Vasquez checked his watch. Today's Friday. Marcus turned for the door. Then let's go. The Blue Spot was the kind of bar cops frequented. Dim lighting, sturdy booths, a bartender who knew when to keep his mouth shut. Dan sat at a corner table, his cap pulled low, nursing a beer. Mike was at the bar, chatting up a patrol officer. Marcus waited outside in a stolen car, watching the back entrance. Hargrove arrived right on time. He took his usual stool at the end of the bar, ordered his usual bourbon, and made small talk with the bartender like it was any other night. Dan kept his head down, watching from the corner of his eye. An hour passed. Hargrove drank, laughed, played the part of the innocent cop. Then his phone buzzed. Dan stiffened as Hargrove checked it, frowned, and tossed cash on the bar. Mike caught Dan's eye and gave a slight nod. Hargrove was on the move. Dan waited a beat, then followed. The alley behind the bar was poorly lit, the stench of garbage thick in the air. Hargrove walked briskly, glancing over his shoulder once before ducking into a parked sedan. Dan pressed against the wall, listening. The car door opened. A voice. Hushed. Angry. Not my fault they got away. No, I don't know where. Yes, I'll handle it. The door slammed. The car pulled away. Dan memorized the license plate as Marcus's stolen car rolled up beside him. Mike jogged over from the bar entrance. Who was in the car? Dan shook his head. Couldn't see. Marcus leaned out the window. Get in. They followed the sedan at a distance, sticking to side streets as it wound through the city. 20 minutes later, it turned into an industrial park. Mike cursed under his breath. That's Ryerson's old warehouse. Dan's pulse quickened. He's meeting someone. Marcus parked behind a stack of shipping containers. Then let's find out who. The warehouse was quiet, the only light coming from a single office on the second floor. Dan moved first, sticking to the shadows as they approached. The rusted fire escape groaned under their weight as they climbed. The office window was grimy, but the blinds were cracked. Inside, Hargrove stood across from a man in a suit, tall, silver-haired, with a posture that screamed authority. Dan's breath caught. Chief Morales. Mike hissed a curse. Marcus's expression turned to stone. They couldn't hear through the glass, but the tension was clear. Morales pointed at Hargrove, his face red with anger. Hargrove shook his head, gesturing wildly. Then Morales pulled something from his briefcase, a file. Hargrove took it, flipping through the pages. His shoulders slumped. Morales said something final, then turned for the door. Dan signaled to retreat. They made it back to the car just as Morales' sedan pulled away. Mike exhaled sharply. The chief. Marcus stared at the warehouse. We need that file. Dan's hands clenched. Hargrove's still in there. Mike checked his watch. Give him 5 minutes to leave. Then we go in. The wait was agonizing. Finally, Hargrove emerged, the file tucked under his arm. He got in his car and drove off. Marcus started the engine. Let's go. The office was unlocked. The file wasn't there. Dan cursed, flipping over the desk. He took it with him. Mike checked the trash. Nothing. Marcus stood by the window, thinking. Then he moved to the filing cabinet in the corner. The third drawer was locked. Marcus yanked it open with a screech of metal. Inside was a single folder. He pulled it out, flipping it open. Dan leaned over his shoulder. What is it? Marcus's voice was flat. Payments. The pages were spreadsheets, dates, amounts, code names. Thousands of dollars. Hundreds of thousands. And at the bottom, a list of recipients. Hargrove's name was there. So was Morales's. Mike whistled low. Ryerson's been buying protection for years. Dan's stomach turned. This is it. This is what we need. Marcus closed the file. Now we go public. The first light of dawn crept through the blinds of Vasquez's office, casting long shadows across the piles of documents spread over every available surface. Dan's eyes burned from lack of sleep, his fingers still smudged with ink from handling the damning papers all night. The musty smell of old case files mixed with the sharp tang of fresh coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Vasquez leaned back in his creaking chair, the dark circles under his eyes mirroring Dan's own exhaustion. Let me get this straight, he said, rubbing his temples. You broke into police headquarters, stole evidence from a locked room, and now you're telling me the police chief is involved in this conspiracy? Across the room, Mike shifted uncomfortably on the worn-out couch, the springs squeaking beneath him. When you say it like that, it sounds bad. Marcus stood motionless by the window, his silhouette outlined by the growing daylight. He hadn't spoken in nearly an hour, his attention fixed on the quiet street below. The tension in his shoulders was the only sign of the storm raging behind his carefully neutral expression. Dan ran a hand through his greasy hair, realizing he couldn't remember the last time he'd showered. We didn't have a choice. They were going to bury us. He tapped a finger on the most damning document, a ledger detailing payments from Ryerson to various officers, including Chief Morales. This proves it was all a setup from the beginning. The pages showed meticulous records spanning 3 years. Dates, amounts, code names. The sheer scale of the corruption took Dan's breath away. Payments of $5,000 marked BS, bomb scare. $10,000 for CD, character defamation. Larger sums simply labeled insurance. Vasquez picked up a grainy surveillance photo showing Morales meeting with Ryerson's lawyer in a parking garage. This was taken 2 days before the first bomb threat. His voice was heavy with disgust. They've been planning this for months. Mike stood abruptly, pacing the small office. So what now? We can't exactly walk into the DA's office with this. Half the prosecutors probably owe Ryerson favors. The floorboards creaked under his nervous steps. Dan watched dust motes swirl in the sunlight, his mind racing through their dwindling options. Every institution they might normally turn to had been compromised. The police, the courts, maybe even parts of city government. Marcus turned from the window, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. We go public. Vasquez shook his head. No reputable outlet will touch this without verification. And by the time they fact-checked. I know someone, Marcus interrupted. Lena Reyes, investigative reporter for the Herald. She's been digging into police corruption for years. A memory clicked for Dan. The Ferguson exposé? That was her. Marcus nodded. She's clean. And she's got the guts to run this. Mike stopped pacing. You trust her? With my life. The certainty in Marcus's voice left no room for doubt. Vasquez exhaled loudly, pushing back from his desk. All right, but we need to move carefully. Once this gets out, they'll come after us hard. Dan stared at the documents, imagining the earthquake they were about to trigger. Careers would end. Lives would be ruined. The entire power structure of the city's law enforcement would crumble. And they'd be at ground zero when it happened. The drive to Lena Reyes' office took them through the industrial outskirts of the city. Abandoned factories and rundown warehouses lined the streets, their broken windows like hollow eyes watching the stolen sedan pass by. Dan sat in the passenger seat, his fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on his knee. Every passing police car sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system, even though he knew they were looking for three very different men now. Marcus had cut and dyed his hair, Mike wore thick-rimmed glasses as a disguise, and Dan had shaved his beard completely, revealing a pale strip of skin that hadn't seen sunlight in years. You sure about this? Mike asked from the back seat, his voice uncharacteristically small. Marcus didn't answer, his focus locked on the road. The silence stretched until Dan finally replied. No, but it's our only play. The Herald's offices were housed in a converted textile mill, its brick facade covered in ivy and graffiti. Unlike the gleaming media towers downtown, this place had the worn, stubborn look of an institution that had learned to survive on scraps. Lena Reyes met them in the lobby, her sharp eyes taking in their disguises with quiet amusement. She was younger than Dan expected, mid-30s at most, with close-cropped black hair and a scar running through her left eyebrow. Her handshake was firm, her palms rough like someone who'd spent time in the field rather than behind a desk. Marcus, she said with a nod. Last time I saw you, you were testifying before Congress. Last time I saw you, you were getting thrown out of a Pentagon press conference, Marcus countered. A ghost of a smile crossed Lena's face before she turned to Dan and Mike. And you must be the disgraced cops. Dan stiffened, but Mike chuckled. That's us. The department's most wanted. Lena led them through a maze of cluttered desks and buzzing computers. The newsroom hummed with quiet intensity, reporters hunched over keyboards, phones cradled against shoulders. The air smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. Her office was little more than a glass-walled cubicle, every surface covered in files, legal pads, and empty energy drink cans. A map of the city took up one entire wall, studded with colored pins and connected by a web of string. Nice war room, Mike commented. Lena shut the blinds before responding. So, you have something for me? Marcus placed the stolen file on her desk. Everything. For the next hour, they walked her through the evidence. The payment ledgers, the surveillance photos, the damning timelines showing how the bomb threats had been planned weeks in advance. Lena's expression grew darker with each revelation, her fingers flying across a legal pad as she took notes. When they finished, she sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This is bigger than I thought. Dan leaned forward. Can you run it? Lena's eyes flashed. Oh, I'm running it. But we need to do this right. She tapped her pen against the desk. First, I'll need to verify these documents. Second, we'll need backup copies in multiple locations. Third, Mike interrupted. Time is a factor here. Every hour we wait is an hour we use to make this airtight, Lena finished. If I publish now, without corroboration, they'll dismiss it as conspiracy theories. We need to build this so solid that when it hits, there's no spinning it. Marcus nodded. How long? 24 hours. Lena stood, gathering the files. I have sources at the Treasury who can verify these payment trails. A friend in the phone company who can check these call logs. By this time tomorrow, we'll have enough to bring down the whole damn department." Dan exchanged glances with Mike. It was longer than they wanted to wait, but Lena was right. They needed this to stick. "One more thing," Lena said as they stood to leave. She opened a cabinet, pulling out 3 prepaid phones. "Burners. Don't contact anyone else. Don't go anywhere they might look for you. I'll call when it's time." Marcus took the phones, distributing them silently. As they turned to leave, Lena added, "And gentlemen, watch your backs. If they find out what you have before this publishes." Dan nodded, the unspoken warning settling like a stone in his gut. The safe house was an old fishing cabin Mike's uncle owned on the edge of Lake Marlow. The drive took 2 hours, weaving through back roads and double-checking for tails. By the time they arrived, the sun was high in the sky, baking the wooden dock until the planks creaked with heat. Dan stood on the porch, staring at the still water while Mike swept the cabin for bugs. The quiet was unnerving after days of running, jumping at shadows. Even the birds seemed hushed, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Marcus emerged from the tree line, his shirt damp with sweat. "Perimeter's clear. No signs we've been followed." Mike joined them outside, tossing 3 beers from the cooler. "Place is clean. No power, but the generator works." They drank in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Dan's mind kept returning to the file, to the sheer scale of the corruption. How many cases had been tainted? How many innocent people had gone to prison while dirty cops got rich? Mike broke the silence. "You think Morales knew about the bomb threats?" Marcus took a long pull from his beer. "He authorized them." The certainty in his voice sent a chill down Dan's spine. He thought about all the times he'd stood at attention while Morales gave speeches about integrity and service. The way the chief had personally handed him his detective's badge. "After this comes out," Dan said quietly, "there won't be much of a department left." Mike snorted. "Good. Maybe they can rebuild something that doesn't suck." As night fell, they took turns keeping watch. Dan sat by the window during the graveyard shift, the burner phone heavy in his pocket. The moon cast silver light across the lake, turning the water into a rippling mirror. He thought about the life he'd built, the long hours, the missed birthdays, the relationships ruined by the job. All for an institution that had been rotten to the core. The anger came then, hot and sudden, tightening his chest until he had to stand and pace the creaky floorboards. The phone vibrated just before dawn. Dan nearly dropped it in his haste to answer. "Yeah." Lena's voice was crisp with adrenaline. "It's done. The story goes live in 1 hour. Get somewhere safe and turn on the news." He woke the others with sharp shakes. As they gathered around the battery-powered radio, the first hints of pink colored the eastern sky. Mike fidgeted with the dial. "How big you think this is gonna be?" Marcus stared at the horizon. "Earthquake." The radio crackled to life just as the sun breached the trees. The lead story wasn't theirs yet. Some political scandal in Washington. Then, at exactly 6 a.m., the anchor's tone shifted. "We're receiving breaking news this morning about an alleged corruption scandal within the city police department." Dan's breath caught as the details spilled out. The payments, the conspiracy, the chief's involvement. The anchor sounded stunned, repeating phrases like unprecedented and shocking allegations. Mike hooped, punching the air. "We did it!" But Marcus remained still, his eyes locked on the radio as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Dan understood his caution. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The anchor continued. In related news, the department has issued arrest warrants for former officer Daniel Mercer and Army veteran Marcus Johnson in connection with. Mike turned the volume down. Well, that was fast. Marcus stood, stretching his shoulders. Time to go. Dan checked the burner phone. A text from Lena with an address. She's got a contact at the FBI. Someone clean. Mike grabbed their makeshift go bags from the corner. Then what are we waiting for? As they stepped out into the morning light, Dan took one last look at the peaceful lake. Whatever came next, there was no turning back. The reckoning had begun. The FBI field office was a nondescript concrete building in the government district. Its windows tinted dark against the morning sun. Dan counted 7 news vans parked outside, their satellite dishes raised like strange mechanical flowers. "Looks like the circus has arrived," Mike muttered from the back seat. Marcus parked 3 blocks away, studying the building through binoculars. "Front entrance is swarmed. We'll need another way in." Dan's phone buzzed with another text from Lena. ** Agent Ruiz waiting at loading dock. Password is Blue J. *. They approached through a maze of service alleys, Dan's pulse pounding in his ears. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every distant siren a potential raid. The loading dock was deserted except for a lone figure in a dark suit, a compact woman with her hair pulled into a tight bun, her posture radiating military precision. "Stop right there," she commanded as they neared, her hand resting near her hip. Dan raised his hand slightly. Blue J. The agent, Ruiz, didn't relax. "IDs. All of you." They handed over their driver's licenses, watching as she compared them to photos on her tablet. After an agonizing minute, she nodded. "Follow me. And don't touch anything." The service elevator smelled of disinfectant and stale air. Ruiz didn't speak as they ascended, her sharp eyes scanning each of them in turn. When the doors opened, they stepped into a hive of activity. Agents rushing between cubicles, banks of monitors showing news coverage from around the city, phones ringing off hooks. Ruiz led them to a small interrogation room, its walls lined with soundproof foam. "Wait here." The door clicked shut behind her. Mike immediately began pacing. "Cozy." Dan sank into one of the hard plastic chairs, his body aching with exhaustion. The room had no windows, no clock, just a mirror that was definitely two-way glass. He wondered how many agents were watching them right now, analyzing their every twitch. Marcus remained standing near the door, his arms crossed. "They'll separate us soon." As if on cue, the door opened to reveal 3 agents, Ruiz and 2 older men in identical dark suits. The lead agent had close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone used to giving orders. "I'm Assistant Director Crane," he said without preamble. "You've caused quite a stir this morning." Dan started to rise, but Crane waved him down. "Save it. We've been tracking Ryerson's operation for months. Your little stunt nearly blew our entire investigation." Mike bristled. "Our stunt just exposed the police chief as a criminal." Crane's smile didn't reach his eyes, and compromised 3 undercover operations in the process. He tossed a file on the table. "But what's done is done. Now we need damage control." The file contained immunity agreements, thick stacks of legalese that promised no prosecution in exchange for full cooperation. Dan scanned the pages, his legal training picking out the key points. "You want us to testify," he said. Crane nodded. "Before a federal grand jury. Names, dates, everything you know about Ryerson's network." Marcus didn't touch his copy. "And after?" "That depends on you." Crane leaned against the table. "We can relocate you. New identities. Or you can take your chances here, though I wouldn't recommend it. Ryerson still has friends on the outside." Dan exchanged glances with Mike. The thought of walking away from his life was staggering. His apartment, his few remaining friendships, everything he'd built. But what was left for him here now? Ruiz spoke for the first time since the elevator. "There's one more thing." She slid a photo across the table. Security camera footage of Hargrove entering a private airstrip. "He was trying to flee when we picked him up an hour ago. Had this in his briefcase." The second photo showed a handwritten list with Dan, Mike, and Marcus's names at the top. Next to each, a dollar amount. Mike whistled. "That's a hell of a price tag." "Contract from Ryerson," Crane confirmed. "He wants you dead before you can testify." The room went silent. Dan stared at the numbers, the neat handwriting so at odds with the violence it promised. Marcus finally picked up his pen. "Where do I sign?" The safe house was a bland suburban home in a neighborhood so average it felt surreal. Trimmed lawns, basketball hoops over garage doors, the occasional dog barking behind a fence. Dan stood at the living room window, watching a pair of kids ride bikes down the street. It had been 72 hours since they'd signed the agreements, 48 since Hargrove's arrest made national news. The fallout was spreading faster than anyone had predicted. Federal takeovers of entire precincts, daily press conferences from the mayor, protests and counter-protests flooding the streets. Mike came in from the kitchen, stuffing a sandwich in his mouth. "You seen this?" He turned on the TV, flipping to a news channel. The screen showed Chief Morales being led from his home in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury. The cheering below read, "Police chief indicted on racketeering charges." Mike cheered through a mouthful of bread. "Bastard!" Marcus emerged from the basement, freshly showered and shaved. He barely glanced at the screen. "Ruiz is coming in 20. Final prep before the grand jury." Dan turned from the window. "You think this will actually change anything?" For a long moment, Marcus didn't answer. Then, "No, but it's a start." The doorbell rang precisely at noon. Ruiz stood on the porch, her usual crisp suit replaced by jeans and a leather jacket. "Car's out back. Let's go." As they drove through the quiet suburbs, Dan watched the ordinary lives passing by. A woman gardening, a mail carrier making his rounds, a group of kids playing in a sprinkler. It all seemed impossibly distant from the world of corruption and violence they'd been living in. The courthouse was surrounded by barricades and news vans. Ruiz took a service entrance, flashing her badge at a series of checkpoints. The halls were eerily quiet, their footsteps echoing off marble floors. The grand jury room was smaller than Dan expected. Just a long table with about 20 citizens seated in folding chairs. No judge, no defense attorneys, just a prosecutor who nodded as they entered. Ruiz squeezed Dan's shoulder. "Remember the truth. All of it." As Dan took his seat, he caught sight of a familiar face in the back row. Lena Reyes gave him an almost imperceptible nod, her reporter's notebook already open. The prosecutor began. "State your name for the record." Dan took a deep breath. "Daniel Mercer." And he began to speak. The federal courthouse smelled of lemon polish and anxiety. Dan adjusted his tie for the 10th time, the starched collar chafing his neck. Through the narrow window in the witness room door, he could see the overflow crowd packing the gallery. Reporters, cops, curious citizens who'd lined up for hours to get a seat. Ruiz handed him a glass of water. "Nervous?" Dan's laugh came out strained. "What gave it away?" Across the room, Mike paced like a caged animal, his dress shoes squeaking on the linoleum. "Remind me again why we can't just send written statements?" "Because the jury needs to see your pretty face," Ruiz deadpanned. She checked her watch. "Johnson's up first. Should be any minute now." A monitor in the corner showed a live feed from the courtroom. Judge Holloway, a no-nonsense woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, was settling onto the bench. The prosecution team looked polished and prepared, while Ryerson's high-priced defense attorney kept whispering urgently to his client. And there, at the defendant's table, sat Anthony Ryerson. Dan's breath caught. Even in an ill-fitting suit, the former captain radiated menace. His close-cropped hair had gone gray during his pretrial detention, but his posture remained rigid, his eyes constantly scanning the room like a predator assessing threats. The clerk called, "All rise." Marcus entered through a side door, his stride steady as he approached the witness stand. He'd been cleaned up for trial, hair trimmed, scars more visible without the beard to hide them. But the cold intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. Ryerson's lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, given the witness's criminal history and involvement in the alleged conspiracy, we move to exclude his testimony as unreliable." Judge Holloway didn't even look up from her notes. "Denied. Proceed, Mr. Calloway." The prosecutor, a tall black man with a voice like rolling thunder, began his questioning. "State your name for the record." "Marcus Johnson." For the next hour, Marcus recounted everything. His military service, his role in exposing Ryerson's drug ring, the elaborate setup with the bomb threats. His voice never wavered, even when describing how Ryerson's men had tried to kill him twice during the investigation. Dan watched the jurors' faces. Some leaned forward, hanging on every word. Others looked visibly shaken. Only Juror 7, a middle-aged man with a perpetual frown, seemed unmoved. Then came cross-examination. Ryerson's attorney, a slick litigator named Whitford, approached with a smirk. "Mr. Johnson, isn't it true you were discharged from the Army for violent conduct?" Marcus didn't flinch. "I received an honorable discharge." But you were disciplined for assaulting a superior officer, correct? Objection. Calloway stood. Relevance. Judge Holloway nodded. Sustained. Move along, counselor. Whitford changed tactics. You claim Captain Ryerson framed you for these bomb threats. Yet you have no physical evidence linking him to these crimes, do you? Marcus's gaze flicked to Ryerson. Other than his own ledger detailing payments for bomb scares? The gallery murmured. Whitford's smile tightened. A ledger your accomplice Daniel Mercer conveniently discovered after breaking into police headquarters? Objection. Calloway barked. Sustained. The judge glared at Whitford. One more stunt like that and I'll hold you in contempt. The defense attorney retreated, but the damage was done. Dan could see some jurors frowning, their doubts creeping in. When Marcus stepped down, his expression gave nothing away. But as he passed Dan's seat on his way out, their eyes met, and Dan saw the warning there. They're playing dirty. Mike's testimony came next. He was a natural on the stand, charming, self-deprecating, the perfect counterbalance to Marcus's intensity. He had the jury laughing at his description of police bureaucracy, then silent when he described discovering Ryerson's secret files. But Whitford went hard on his credibility. Officer Reynolds, isn't it true you were suspended twice for excessive force? Mike's smile faded. Those complaints were unfounded. And yet you settled one for $75,000 out of court? Dan clenched his fists. They dug deep for dirt. When Mike returned to the witness room, he collapsed into a chair, rubbing his face. That guy's a shark. Marcus handed him a water bottle. You did fine. Ruiz appeared at the door. Mercer, you're up. Dan's mouth went dry. The walk to the stand felt endless. Every eye in the courtroom followed him. The disgraced cop turned whistleblower. He swore the oath mechanically, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Calloway started gently. Officer Mercer, how long did you serve with the department? 12 years. And during that time, did you ever witness Captain Ryerson engaging in illegal activity? Dan exhaled. Here we go. He told them everything. The doctored evidence, the coerced confessions, the way Ryerson's inner circle operated like their own private gang. He described the night he'd been framed, the warehouse, the damning evidence they'd uncovered. Through it all, Ryerson stared at him with naked hatred. When Calloway finished, Whitford practically leaped to his feet. Officer Mercer, isn't it true you were passed over for promotion 3 times? Dan blinked. Yes, but... And isn't it true you filed a grievance against Captain Ryerson just months before these alleged events? The trap became clear. They were painting this as revenge. Dan kept his voice steady. I filed a complaint about evidence handling procedures. It had nothing to do with... Whitford cut him off. And isn't it true you were addicted to prescription painkillers during this period? The courtroom erupted. Objection! Calloway roared. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Approach! As the lawyers huddled at the bench, Dan's face burned. The accusation wasn't entirely false. He'd taken painkillers after a line-of-duty injury, maybe longer than necessary. But addicted? The judge's voice was low but furious. Where are you going with this, Mr. Whitford? The defense attorney smiled. Simply establishing the witness's credibility issues, Your Honor. Holloway glared. Unless you have medical records to back this up, it's irrelevant. The jury will disregard the last question. But the damage was done. Dan could see the doubt on several jurors' faces. Whitford continued his assault for another grueling hour, picking apart every inconsistency in Dan's story, implying he'd fabricated evidence to get back at Ryerson. By the time Dan stepped down, his shirt was soaked with sweat. As he returned to the witness room, Mike gripped his shoulder. They went after you hardest because you're the most credible. Marcus said nothing, his eyes fixed on the monitor where Ryerson was now whispering urgently to his lawyer. Something had changed. The jury deliberated for 6 days. Dan spent the time in the safe house, jumping at every phone call, analyzing every scrap of news coverage. The trial had become a media circus, with pundits debating everything from police reform to military veterans' mental health. On the 7th morning, Ruiz arrived with 3 suits draped over her arm. They're coming back today. The courthouse was even more packed than before. Security had been doubled, with federal marshals lining the walls. Dan took his seat in the front row, flanked by Marcus and Mike. Across the aisle, Ryerson's family filled an entire bench, stone-faced men and weeping women who glared daggers at the witnesses who betrayed their patriarch. The clerk's voice cut through the tension. "All rise for the jury." Dan held his breath as the 12 jurors filed in. None would meet Ryerson's eye. Judge Holloway addressed them. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a retired schoolteacher with kind eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." A rustle swept through the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. "On the count of racketeering conspiracy, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." A gasp. Ryerson's wife burst into tears. "On the count of obstruction of justice?" "Guilty." The list went on: bribery, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder. 27 counts in all. 27 guilty verdicts that echoed like gunshots in the silent courtroom. When the last verdict was read, Judge Holloway fixed Ryerson with a look of pure contempt. "Anthony Ryerson, you have betrayed your badge, your colleagues, and every citizen you swore to protect." She nodded to the marshals. "Take him into custody." As the marshals approached, Ryerson suddenly turned to face Dan. His lips pulled back in a snarl. "This isn't over, Mercer." Then he was gone, led away to a holding cell until sentencing. The gallery erupted. Cheers, sobs, reporters shouting questions as they scrambled for the exits. Dan sat frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Mike hooped, pulling him into a rough hug. "We did it!" Marcus remained still, watching the empty defendant's table with narrowed eyes. Dan knew what he was thinking. Ryerson's threat hadn't been empty. This was far from over. 3 months later, Dan stood on a beach in Oregon, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. The salt air stung his face, a welcome change from the city smog he'd breathed for over a decade. The cottage behind him was small but sturdy, its cedar walls weathered by ocean winds. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering light across the sparse furnishings. His new life. The relocation program had given him a choice: stay in the city with a new identity, or start fresh somewhere distant. He'd chosen the latter. Mike had opted for Miami, sending weekly texts about bikinis and mojitos. Marcus had disappeared into the mountains of Colorado, his last message simply reading, "Stay sharp." Dan turned at the sound of tires on gravel. A familiar sedan pulled up the drive, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Ruiz stepped out, her leather jacket replaced by a windbreaker. "You look like crap, Mercer." Dan grinned. "Missed you too." She joined him at the water's edge, handing over a thick envelope. "Case files. Thought you'd want to see how it all shook out." Dan leafed through the contents: sentencing reports, news clippings, follow-up investigations. Ryerson had gotten 40 years without parole. Hargrove, 25. Over 24 officers had been indicted, with more investigations ongoing. Morales? Dan asked. Pled out. 15 years. Ruiz shook her head. The whole department's being rebuilt from scratch. They stood in silence as the waves crashed against the shore. Finally, Ruiz cleared her throat. "There's one more thing." She handed him a small card, plain white, with a single phone number. Dan raised an eyebrow. "Witness protection isn't forever," Ruiz said. "If you ever want back in, we could use someone with your experience." Dan stared at the number, feeling the old instincts stir, the thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of justice served. But the ocean called louder. He pocketed the card with a non-committal nod. "I'll think about it." Ruiz smirked, knowing him better than that. "Sure you will." As her taillights disappeared down the coastal road, Dan turned back to the water. Somewhere out there, Marcus was watching his own horizon. Mike was probably charming some bartender, and Ryerson was rotting in a cell. The thought brought a quiet smile to his face. He walked back to the cottage as the first stars appeared, ready for whatever came next.